So CNN had Tulsi Gabbard town hall at South by Southwest last night, and it was a pathetic display. I mean, just really, really pathetic. Not pathetic because of Tulsi Gabbard. I think she did a fine job, but pathetic because of the questions, how it was structured, what they were trying to do. Now, Tulsi Gabbard was the middle act, and there was a town hall right before. 1980s sitcom soccer dad John Delaney is a guy who apparently is running for president, who I knew nothing about until yesterday. I only caught like 2 minutes of his town hall. From what I've been told from others, he's a snooze fest. And then after Tulsi Gabbard, you had Pete Buttigieg, who is a judger of booties, and he is actually, he's not a terrible candidate. I mean, he's basically, he kind of bases his political career to one extent or another off of Bernie Sanders. He wrote this long thing, I think, in college that was basically an ode to Bernie Sanders. Now, his policies today, judging based off of what he was saying at the town hall, he's not as left as Bernie Sanders, but at least he's somewhat of a refreshing voice on many issues. But he's also, he's really young. Not that that's a disqualifier, because Tulsi's young as well. But he also strikes me as very, his political approach in terms of how he presents himself is very old school. It's very 1990s. It's very, when he talks, it's not to the point. It's kind of long and drawn out, and he seems like he's coached. But we'll put aside Buttigieg and John Delaney, the sitcom dad, for a little bit here, and let's just talk about what happened with Tulsi. So I would show you some clips, but we're not going to get into it. There's like 8 different clips that I could have focused on and done separate segments on, but I just want to talk about the overall thing that happened. So strike number 1 on CNN is this. They hid the identities of the Democratic operatives again. Now, they did this to Bernie. They would say, oh, a teacher from Idaho is going to ask a question here. And then you would find out very quickly, that's not a teacher from Idaho. That's, somebody who works with some establishment Democratic think tank, and they were sent there to do their bullshit hack questions to try to kneecap Bernie Sanders. And they didn't disclose it. That's the most important thing. I mean, it's okay to ask tough questions, but a lot of these questions were hacky. But even if they were fair questions, you're not disclosing who's asking the question and what potential conflicts of interest they have, and if they're probably fucking sent from the DNC or whatever it may be. So that was strike number 1, is that Tulsi had a lot of those plants. She had a lot of those people who are Democratic operatives who are out there to try to kneecap her and to try to put her in a corner and to try to misleadingly frame questions to make her step in it no matter what her answer is. So that was strike number 1, and it's clear that there was some fuckery afoot. Then after that, listen, I want to give you the first 21 minutes. I looked at the clock. The first 21 minutes, at least, it was probably even longer than that. There was not a single substantive question. So I jotted them down. The first one was, how can you be against war when you were in the military? Now, it was worded differently, but that was the gist of it. Like, wait, you were in the military and you don't want to be bombing 42 countries offensively, illegally? Like, that was the first question. Infuriating. Then, of course, we get to, I think it was the second question, something about Assad. And then Dana Bash, who's the CNN host, wakes up and basically says to her, like, okay, will you condemn him tonight here? Will you call him a war criminal? Will you say bad things about the official state baddie, please? I don't understand why you're not doing that. Can you please do that more? You should do that more. So we went from, how can you be against war, to condemn our official state enemies. Then we go to a question in the audience, and it's on Medicare for All. But it's not a reasonable question on Medicare for All, because there's a million reasonable questions on Medicare for All. The question is, basically, wouldn't Medicare for All cost like way too many jobs? So every single question is framed from a pro-establishment right-wing perspective. Every single one to this point. Then we get to, isn't Ilhan Omar an anti-Semite? Will you please condemn Ilhan Omar? And then we get to about 10 minutes, and that might not be an exaggeration, of digging into her religion. So we go from, How can you be against war, condemn Assad, isn't he so evil, wouldn't Medicare for all cost jobs, isn't Ilhan Omar an anti-Semite, and then 10 minutes in, it's, or for 10 minutes, it's, tell us about how you're Hindu, let me ask you 1,000 questions. There was a question about her anti-gay past, which is a fine question, but she's gotten more shit for her anti-gay past, and her voting record, by the way, is 100% pro-gay, because by the time she was a lawmaker, she was already on the side of the gay community. But she was asked more questions about her anti-gay past when she has a solid voting record than Hillary Clinton ever was about her anti-gay past, and she didn't have a 100% pro-gay voting record the further back you go. So, it was a hit job. That's what it was. It was a hit job. Now, some people are saying, oh, well, she did a good job fending off the questions. That's somewhat true, but these are set up so you can't win. Like, the way they set this up is that so she can't win. And my concern is, while she does have very thoughtful answers, my concern is with Tulsi that there's a lot, it takes her a while to get her point out. Because she's not, take me, for example. I do this shit for a living. Now, I know how to fucking just go, and I could talk, and I could fill a long time slot. But when you're put in a position where you're debating, you're put in a position where you're on the spot, you have to change gears. And the gear has to become, if you're presented with something that's like preposterous in the framing of it, you have to be able to, in a very quick soundbite, slap it down and reframe it. And my concern with Tulsi is that she gets these hacky questions, okay, these pro-establishment, pro-right-wing framed questions, and then she gives like a 4 or 5 minute thoughtful response, which is an adequate response, but most Americans nowadays have the attention span of a gnat, and they're going to, after like 35 seconds, they're like, oh, I mean, what's going on over here? Change the channel. Let me get my Hot Pocket out of the microwave, and 1,000 other things that are going through their minds. So, listen, that's just my take on it. Some of you may disagree. I think she did a great job in terms of if you actually look at her answers and you're listening to her answers and you see how she handled herself when she was painted into a corner a million times over. But if I was advising her, that's what my advice would be to her. You got to sharpen. You got to sharpen. You got to come quicker with the fucking punch right through responses that slap it down, reframe it, and get you a pop from the audience. And that's how you know you've succeeded. If you could slap down a dumb question, quickly reframe it, and then the audience pops and they go, "Oh shit, that was a great answer." So, but it's not easy. That's the thing. It's not easy to do this. That's actually very difficult for many people, is on the spot to flip it, reframe it, and get the audience to like totally get it and go along with you in the short soundbite. It's tough, but listen, I told you, and I tweeted this a long time ago, and it was one of the tweets where I think I may have said in the tweet, like, save this, I guarantee you it's going to come true. And it is. I said, the media is going to go with kid gloves on every Democratic primary candidate, except Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and even Elizabeth Warren. Because even though you and I know, hey, Elizabeth Warren, she's good, but she's got one foot in the establishment camp, one foot in the progressive camp, mainstream media doesn't view her that way. They view her almost exactly like Bernie Sanders. They think she's like female Bernie Sanders. So, those are the three who are going to get shit. Now, some of you might say, oh, what about Andrew Yang? Well, they're just not going to talk about Andrew Yang. So it's one thing, Bernie and Tulsi and Elizabeth Warren will get nothing but negative coverage. They won't even bother to mention Andrew Yang. But if he ever were to become viable enough where they would talk about him, then they would also include him in the category of just, shit on him all day long, ask misleading questions. And by the way, the setup is this. The way CNN asked the questions and how long and thoughtful Tulsi's answers were, I saw the headlines immediately after, the town hall where they were like, Tulsi Gabbard refuses to call Assad a war criminal. So, again, it's all in the framing. They did the misleading framing of the questions. No matter how Tulsi answers, it's not going to be satisfactory to them. And then, boom, they get to run with the headlines of, oh, my goodness, Tulsi Gabbard, she refused to call Assad a war criminal. And it's the gotchaism. That's what it is. It's all gotchaism. And they're trying to tank her campaign because she's actually going to change some stuff up. And it's disgusting, is what it is. And for people who don't see through it. And as I'm watching this, I'm going, people wonder why CNN blows and they get terrible ratings. Because it's not just the right. I mean, they would love to have you believe that only the far right thinks CNN is fake news, but that's not true. The left also thinks it because of things like what happened last night. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Everything is from a pro-establishment framing. And people get it twisted oftentimes. They say, oh, the media has a liberal bias. The media only has a liberal bias. The media has a corporate bias, pro-corporate bias. So that manifests as, on social issues, yes, they have a liberal bias. So they don't hate gay people, they don't hate minorities, they don't hate black people. That is true. Corporate media is not socially conservative. Because corporations know that those people are customers too. So on social issues, yes, they have a liberal bias. On economic issues, they are massively, massively pro-status quo, which is why you have the most bullshit questions on Medicare for All, for example, on free college, come from corporate media, come from CNN, come from MSNBC, come from the nightly news channels, because they are not in favor of shaking up the system. And there's a lot of money in the way the system functions now, and they don't want big change. So it's a misnomer to say, oh, the media has a liberal bias. On social issues, sure, I'll give you that. But really, ultimately, it's a pro-corporate bias, and that means that on economics, they're actually massively conservative. And you can see it because they go after candidates like Bernie, they go after candidates like Tulsi. Now, in the case of Bernie, we're so used to it with Bernie, and I've spoken about this before. Ultimately, I think it will help Bernie. Ultimately, I think the media's really hacky attacks against Bernie Sanders, I think they will help Bernie. In the same way that when they just nonstop, day and night shitting on Trump, oftentimes using bad arguments, that helped Trump. In the case of Tulsi, I'm not sure if it will ultimately help her. I'm not sure, because it certainly strikes me like to your average political person, some of the stuff against Tulsi sticks. Because it's so relentless, and people aren't as well versed in the nuances of the issues. And I'm not sure if ultimately the media being totally against Tulsi is going to help Tulsi in the same way that I'm convinced the media being so against Bernie is going to help Bernie. Now, we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe this obvious onslaught against Tulsi helps her. Maybe it is. But in the case of Bernie, he already has so much name recognition, whereas Tulsi doesn't have nearly as much name recognition as Bernie. But Bernie has so much name recognition, and people already know exactly what he's about, that you can't, no matter how much you try to trip him up and do gotchaism and say, oh, you flew a plane and you say you care about climate change. It's not going to work. It's going to help Bernie, if anything. With Tulsi, I'm not sure if the media being against her is going to help her. But either way, I think it was a grotesque display from CNN. I think that Tulsi did as good of a job as she could have possibly done on the fly. And what she is really good at is staying calm as she's being grossly smeared and everything is framed in an impossibly stupid way. She's really great at that. I would just tell her if I was advising her, you have to sharpen up your answers. You got to be shorter, you got to be punchier, you got to be to the point more. And the best example of that was on Ilhan Omar. She was asked, hey, is she anti-Semitic? Or were her comments anti-Semitic? And her answer was way too political for me. I mean, I know she feels like she has to balance interests and she can't just come out and say, no, it was a coordinated smear campaign. But that's the answer. The answer is it was a coordinated smear campaign. Her comments were obviously against money in politics and against AIPAC buying our politicians to get pro-Israeli legislation through. And that's the correct answer. The correct answer is no, she's not an anti-Semite. This has been a coordinated smear campaign, and the way she's been treated is disgusting. But she didn't answer like that. It was the typical political. And to be fair to Tulsi, it's all these politicians who are saying the same thing. Maybe Bernie was the most aggressive in defending Ilhan, but even he wasn't totally, saying, oh, it was a smear campaign. So, but, her answer was something like, some people were perceiving it as that, but I think her intent was to talk about the issue of foreign policy and how we act in the world with our allies. And it has to be fair game to talk about what our relationship is with our allies. So she did a semi-defense. But, I'm always a fan of, and this is the last thing that idiot strategists will tell you to do in Washington, D.C. I'm always a fan of the direct answer. They'll tell you if you get, faced with a question and the question is worded strangely that you can basically turn to Muhammad Ali and dance around it and then somehow get away unscathed. I think that people are smarter than those strategists give them credit for, and people know immediately when you're dancing around a question. Like they think they're getting away with it. They're not getting away with it. Everybody sees like, oh, you're dancing around it. I see that. Whereas they think like, oh no, they're getting away with it. See, they're dancing. No, that's not. It's not like people aren't aware of what you're doing. So I'm always a fan of just give the answer up front, and then you could say whatever you want to say. So were Ilhan Omar's comments anti-Semitic? No. Now here's why. And I think that's one of the reasons why people like Bernie is because Bernie always does that. He's always like, no, wrong. Here's what I actually think about it. But he'll tell you up front, and then he won't start with like, be a Neo from the Matrix and dodge it like, oh. But anyway, CNN did a horrendous display, and they should be embarrassed.